Picture London in 2005. You're standing on a corner near Piccadilly Circus, and the street is filled with the distinctive shape you've known for nearly half a century. The Austin FX4. That unmistakable silhouette with its high roofline, the gentle curve of those wheel arches, the reassuring solidity of a design that had barely changed since Eisenhower was president. These weren't just taxis. They were London itself, as recognizable as Big Ben or a red telephone box. Now fast forward just 5 years to 2010. You're standing on that same corner and something feels wrong. You scan the taxi rank and suddenly you realize what's missing. The FX4s are gone. Not just a few of them, nearly all of them. In their place are newer TX models that look similar but somehow different. How did this happen? How did a taxi that had survived for nearly 40 years in production vanish from London's streets in what felt like the blink of an eye? This isn't a story about a car being replaced by something better. This is about how a beloved icon was legislated out of existence and how thousands of London cabbies fought tooth and nail to keep their faithful workhorses on the road. It's about the unintended consequences of environmental regulations and about the end of an era that many people never even realized was ending. The FX4's disappearance represents something larger than just the retirement of an old model. It was the moment when modern emissions standards collided with British tradition, when bureaucracy trumped nostalgia, and when one of the world's most recognizable vehicles was forced into retirement not because it stopped working, but because it couldn't meet new rules written in Brussels and enforced in London. The mystery isn't just how it vanished so quickly, it's why hardly anyone noticed until it was too late. Section 1. The icon that refused to die. On a July morning in 1958, a black taxi with the registration number VLW431 rolled out onto London's streets for testing with York Way Motors. This was the first production Austin FX4, and nobody could have predicted that this design would still be in production 4 decades later. The FX4 was born from a collaboration between 3 companies, each bringing something crucial to the table. Austin Motor Company provided the mechanical components and engineering expertise. Mann and Overton, London's premier taxi dealership, commissioned the project and actually paid for half of its development cost. And Carbodies, the Coventry coach builder, designed the body and assembled the complete vehicles. The original design came from Austin's Eric Bailey, while Carbodies' Jake Donaldson engineered it for production. When the FX4 was officially launched at the Commercial Motor Exhibition at Earl's Court later that year, it caused quite a stir. An order worth £24 million, equivalent to over 700 million today, was placed at the show for 2,000 FX4s. This wasn't just confidence in a new model, this was recognition that London had found its next generation taxi. What made the FX4 revolutionary for its time? It was the first London taxi to feature 4 doors. Previous models, including the FX3 that preceded it, had a luggage platform open to the elements where the front passenger seat should have been. Imagine being a London cabbie in the 1950s, driving through those famous London fogs with nothing but empty space beside you. The FX4 changed all that, putting a proper door and window on the passenger side while still maintaining ample luggage space. Under that distinctive body sat a 2,178 cubic centimetre Austin diesel engine, paired with a Borg-Warner automatic transmission, though a manual gearbox from the Austin Gypsy became available as an option in 1961. The engineering was purposeful and practical. The FX4 featured independent front suspension and dual-circuit hydraulic brakes, proper safety features for a vehicle that would spend its life in heavy city traffic. But here's what made the FX4 truly special for London's demanding taxi trade. The front wheels used Ackerman steering geometry, which allowed the taxi to execute a complete U-turn in just 7.6 meters or 25 feet. This wasn't a clever marketing feature. It was a legal requirement set by the Public Carriage Office for operation on London's narrow streets. Every single FX4 had to meet this standard, and everyone did. The early FX4s had their quirks. They featured small rear light clusters and those distinctive roof-mounted turn indicators that everyone called bunny ears. Communication between driver and passenger was through a circular disc in the partition. Some of the very first models didn't even have a rear view mirror, ensuring passengers' privacy but making life interesting for the driver. As the 1960s progressed, the FX4 proved its worth. By 1968, when the last FX3s finally departed London's taxi ranks, the FX4 comprised nearly all the cabs in the capital. This wasn't just market dominance, it was complete acceptance by the notoriously conservative community of London taxi drivers. Section 2. Evolution through the decades. In 1971, car bodies increased the engine capacity to 2,520 cubic centimeters. This upgrade lifted the top speed by 10 miles per hour to 70 miles per hour and improved the FX4's already legendary reliability. Most importantly, it gave the diesel engine the torque it needed for the stop and start punishment of London traffic. The 1970s and early 80s brought a series of updates that kept the FX4 relevant without fundamentally changing its character. The bunny ear indicators were replaced with conventional units mounted on the body. Sound-deadening material was added, making the cabin quieter. The partition was angled to give the driver more legroom. New rocker switches replaced old toggle switches. These weren't dramatic changes, but they showed that someone was paying attention to what taxi drivers actually needed. A curious thing happened in 1982. British Leland, Austin's parent company, lost interest in the taxi business and car bodies took over the intellectual property rights. Suddenly, the company that had been building FX4 bodies for Austin was now responsible for the entire vehicle. The old Austin diesel engine was no longer available due to the closure of British Leyland's Courthouse Green engine plant. So car bodies selected the Land Rover 2,286 cubic centimeter diesel engine as its replacement. This engine swap led to an interesting chapter. Some operators replaced the Land Rover unit with a Perkins Mazda 2,977 cubic centimeter diesel, which dramatically improved performance. The Perkins conversion was powerful and reliable, but it gained a reputation for being noisy at idle. More problematically, it was mistakenly blamed for causing cracks in the chassis, though this turned out to be a manufacturing fault affecting multiple engine configurations. To regain lost sales, car bodies created the FX4Q, refurbishing old chassis and suspension components and fitting them with new bodywork and the original type 2,520 cubic centimeter diesel engines re-imported from India. Because these vehicles used refurbished components, they were required to have registration marks starting with the letter Q rather than the current year letter. It was a creative solution that kept FX4s in production when new chassis weren't available. In 1984, a significant corporate change occurred. Manganese Bronze Holdings bought Mann and Overton, the London taxi dealers, and formed London Taxis International, bringing manufacturing and retail under one umbrella for the first time. LTI replaced the Land Rover engine with a newer 2,495 cubic centimeter version and called the updated model the FX4S. The FX4S Plus followed in 1987 with a rear compartment redesigned to accommodate 5 passengers instead of 4. The trim changed to grey and a new grey plastic molded dashboard was fitted, featuring instrument clusters and switches borrowed from the Austin Metro. These updates were well received by the taxi trade as signs that their needs were being heard. In February 1989 came the Fairway, fitted with a 2,664 cubic centimeter Nissan TD27 diesel engine. This Japanese power plant would become crucial to the FX4's story. The Nissan engine was more refined, more reliable, and more economical than previous units. Many older FX4s were retrofitted with this engine to extend their working lives. The Fairway Driver arrived in 1992 with front disc brakes developed by AP Lockheed and a new suspension system designed by GKN, all while maintaining that mandatory 7.6-meter turning circle. These late-model Fairways represented the pinnacle of FX4 evolution, combining decades of refinement with modern components. On the 1st of October 1997, the very last Fairway rolled off the production line at Carbody's Coventry factory. Its registration mark was R1PFX, a deliberate choice that every taxi driver understood immediately. RIP FX, rest in peace, FX. This final vehicle was presented to the National Motor Museum at Beaulieu, marking the end of nearly 40 years of continuous production. In all, more than 75,000 FX4s had been built. Section 3. The replacement arrives. Also in 1997, London Taxis International launched the TX1, designed by renowned industrial designer Kenneth Grange to replace the aging FX4. The TX1 was interesting because Grange deliberately retained the FX4's distinctive styling cues while incorporating 1990s updates. The TX1 had smoother aerodynamics, better visibility, and improved passenger amenities including a CD player, vanity mirrors, and reading lights, luxuries that the Spartan FX4 had never offered. The TX1 was powered by the same Nissan TD27 diesel engine that had proven so successful in the late FX4 Fairways. This continuity was deliberate. Why fix what wasn't broken? The engine was reliable, economical, and familiar to mechanics who had been servicing Fairway taxis for years. But here's where the story takes its crucial turn. The TX1, for all its improvements, complied only with Euro 2 emission standards. When it was launched in 1997, this was perfectly adequate. Euro 2 had only been mandated the previous year. Nobody was looking ahead to what was coming. By the late 1990s, approximately 7,000 TX1 vehicles were in operation across the UK, with around 4,000 serving London's streets. Drivers appreciated the elevated seating position for better visibility and the vehicle's reliability. The TX1 maintained that critical 25-foot turning circle and kept the iconic black cab silhouette that passengers could hail without thinking. In 2002, the TX1 was replaced by the T82, which used a Ford Duratorque diesel engine to achieve Euro 3 compliance. This should have been a routine model update, another step in the evolution that had kept black cabs current for decades, but something else was happening in Brussels and in London that would change everything. Section 4. The regulatory guillotine. Transport for London, which had taken over control of the Public Carriage Office, made a decision that would prove devastating for FX4 owners. In 2006, they ruled that all taxis licensed in London must comply with Euro 3 exhaust emission regulations. Let's be clear about what this meant. The Euro 3 standard, which had been introduced for new vehicle approvals back in January 2000, limited nitrogen oxide emissions to 0.5 grams per kilometre for diesel engines, among other requirements. These weren't unreasonable standards for new vehicles, but applying them retroactively to existing taxis was another matter entirely. The Fairway taxis, those late-model FX4s with Nissan engines, only complied with Euro 2. So did the TX1, the FX4's supposed replacement. Suddenly, thousands of perfectly functional taxis faced being forced off the road. For cab drivers who had invested their life savings in their vehicles, who had maintained them meticulously, who were still making payments on them, this was catastrophic. Most proprietors were understandably reluctant to scrap their very reliable and economical Fairways. These vehicles routinely covered hundreds of thousands of miles with nothing more than routine servicing. They were paid for, or nearly paid for. They were known quantities, and now they were being told their livelihoods were being legislated away. The taxi trade fought back with everything they had. In the face of intense pressure from drivers, Transport for London allowed different conversion systems to be developed that could be fitted to the Nissan engine to make it Euro 3 compliant. Two systems emerged: the STT MTEC Clean Cab turbocharger system and the Van Aken exhaust gas recirculation system. These conversions weren't cheap. Drivers had to spend nearly £2,000 to have their cabs converted, but many chose to do it rather than buy a new or second-hand TX2. They loved their fairways. They trusted them. £2,000 for a conversion was painful, but manageable. £40,000 or more for a new taxi was impossible for many drivers. Only 80 Austin and Rover-engined cabs remained on the road by this time, making it uneconomical to develop conversions for them. These oldest survivors were granted an exemption, a small mercy for the few drivers still running truly vintage FX4s. But here's what the regulations didn't account for. The FX4s and fairways that underwent these conversions were living on borrowed time. More stringent regulations were already in the pipeline. Euro 4 was coming in 2006. Euro 5 was on the horizon. Each new standard made it harder and more expensive to keep the old taxis compliant. Section 5. The Vanishing Act. Between 2006 and 2010, something remarkable happened on London's streets. The FX4s simply melted away. Not all at once. There was no single day when they disappeared. But month by month, year by year, the oldest taxis were replaced. Drivers who had resisted retiring their FX4s finally gave in when faced with yet another round of conversions, yet another regulatory hurdle, yet another expense. Some drivers chose to retrofit their older FX4s with Nissan engines and the Euro 3 conversion systems, extending their working lives by a few more years. But this was delaying the inevitable. The writing was on the wall. London's emission standards would only get stricter. Eventually, no amount of conversions would save vehicles that were fundamentally designed in the 1950s. By 2009, the FX4 had essentially vanished from regular taxi service in London. A few survivors remained, cherished by drivers who refused to let them go or kept as backup vehicles. But the dominant presence they had maintained since 1968 was gone. In its place were TX series taxis that looked similar but were fundamentally modern vehicles. The speed of this transition shocked even people who lived through it. In 2005, you could still see dozens of fairways in any London taxi rank. By 2010, spotting one felt like seeing a ghost. The FX4 hadn't gradually aged into retirement. It had been regulated out of existence, pushed off the streets by rules that made continued operation economically impossible. What made this particularly poignant was that many of these taxis still had years of working life left in them. The FX4's legendary durability meant that vehicles from the 1980s and 1990s were still mechanically sound. Drivers knew their taxis inside and out. They had relationships with mechanics who could fix anything that went wrong. But none of that mattered when the taxi couldn't meet emissions standards. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the trade. These were diesels, vehicles that had been promoted for decades as the environmentally responsible choice because they produced less carbon dioxide than petrol engines. Now those same diesels were being demonized for their nitrogen oxide and particulate emissions. The goalposts had moved and the FX4 couldn't move with them. Section 6. The legacy survives. Today, surviving FX4s command respect and decent money in the classic car market. Average sale prices hover around $15,000, with exceptional examples fetching over $20,000. The lowest recorded sale was around $7,800 for a rough 1967 model, while a pristine 1972 example brought $22,000 at auction. These aren't huge numbers compared to classic sports cars or luxury vehicles, but they represent real value for what were, after all, working vehicles. Many FX4s logged over 300,000 miles in taxi service. Finding low-mileage examples is rare and commands a premium. The FL2, the private hire version of the FX4, attracts particular interest. These vehicles had forward-facing occasional seats, a second front seat, and carried no roof sign. They were aimed at the limousine and funeral trade. Some were even stretched by 18 inches between the front and rear doors to create 6-door variants. Prince Philip owned one, so did Laurence Olivier. Stephen Fry used one for incognito travel around London. Outside London, FX4s found new lives in cities around the world. They appeared in Belfast, Cairo, Singapore, and even some American cities. Their distinctive appearance made them instantly recognizable as symbols of British style and reliability. Some became advertising vehicles, others were converted for private use. A few became hearses or wedding cars. Parts availability remained surprisingly good, with specialist suppliers in the UK maintaining stock of body panels, mechanical components and trim pieces. This ongoing support means that restoring an FX4 is feasible, unlike some classics where sourcing parts becomes an archaeological expedition. The TX series that replaced the FX4 continued its basic styling cues. The TX1, TX2, TX4, and even the current electric LEVC TX all echo the FX4's distinctive silhouette. Kenneth, Granger's design for the TX1 deliberately retained the high roofline, the prominent wheel arches, the upright stance. This wasn't nostalgia for its own sake, it was recognition that the FX4's shape had become inseparable from the concept of a London taxi. Section 7. What the mystery teaches us. The FX4's sudden disappearance teaches us something important about how we retire technology in modern society. This wasn't a case of a vehicle becoming obsolete because something better came along. The FX4 was legislated out of existence by regulations that, while well-intentioned, took no account of the economic reality faced by working taxi drivers. Consider what happened from a driver's perspective. You've invested £30,000 or £40,000 in a fairway in the mid-1990s. You're still making payments on it. The vehicle is running perfectly. You're covering your expenses and supporting your family. Then suddenly you're told that unless you spend £2,000 on emissions conversions, you can't work. A few years later, more regulations arrive requiring more modifications. Eventually, the modifications become impossible or economically absurd, and you're forced to buy a new taxi you can't afford or leave the trade entirely. This created real hardship. Some drivers left the profession rather than take on more debt. Others struggled with financing for new vehicles at ages when banks were reluctant to lend. The transition wasn't managed, it was mandated, with minimal consideration for the people affected. The environmental case for Euro 3 and subsequent standards was legitimate. Diesel particulates and nitrogen oxides do cause health problems. Urban air quality needed improvement, but the speed of the transition and the lack of support for affected drivers created unnecessary suffering. A scrappage scheme, grants for conversions, or longer transition periods might have eased the pain. There's also a cultural loss that's hard to quantify. The FX4 wasn't just a taxi, it was part of London's identity as much as the red buses or the underground roundel. Its disappearance marked the end of a design lineage that stretched back to the 1940s. Yes, the TX series maintains similar styling, but it's not the same. The FX4 had that indefinable quality that comes from a design that evolved organically over decades rather than being deliberately styled to evoke the past. Walk through London today and you'll see the current LEVC TX, a hybrid vehicle that looks back to the FX4's shape while being fundamentally modern. It's quieter, cleaner, and more efficient. It meets the latest emission standards. But something's missing, that sense of continuity with the past, that knowledge that you're riding in something that's barely changed since your grandparents took taxis in the 1960s. The mystery of how the FX4 vanished so quickly has a simple answer. It didn't fail, It didn't become unreliable, it didn't stop working, it was killed by regulations that made its continued operation illegal, regardless of its mechanical condition. In an era where we talk about sustainability and reducing waste, we forced thousands of perfectly functional vehicles into early retirement because they couldn't meet standards that didn't exist when they were built. The FX4's story is a reminder that progress has costs we don't always acknowledge. Cleaner air came at the price of economic hardship for working people and the loss of an icon. Both things can be true simultaneously. The regulations were probably necessary, their implementation was certainly rushed and poorly managed. The Austin FX4 wasn't just London's most iconic taxi, it was a lesson in British engineering persistence, in making a good design and refining it for decades rather than chasing novelty. It proved that you could take a 1950s concept and keep it relevant through the 60s, 70s, 80s and 90s with careful evolution rather than revolution. Its sudden disappearance from London's streets between 2006 and 2010 represents one of the fastest forced retirements of a vehicle type in modern automotive history. Emissions regulations that seemed reasonable on paper collided with economic reality on the streets, and the FX4 lost. Today, when you see an FX4 at a classic car show or catch a glimpse of one still running in private use, remember what it represents, not just nostalgia for an old taxi, but a working vehicle that served London faithfully for 4 decades and was finally forced into retirement, not by age or deterioration, but by rules written in committee rooms far from the taxi ranks. If you had the privilege of driving an FX4, or if you remember when they filled London's streets, we'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. What do you remember most about these remarkable vehicles? Did you experience their disappearance firsthand? Share your memories with us. And if you found this deep dive into automotive history valuable, please consider subscribing to the channel. Hit that like button if you appreciated the research that went into uncovering this story. We'll keep bringing you the untold stories of classic vehicles and the people who loved them. Thank you for watching, and remember, every classic car has a story. Sometimes that story is about how quickly an icon can vanish when the world changes around it.